Hail, fellow beings! This is my last video of 2020. Like everybody else, I'm excited to get this year over with so I can begin blocking it out in my memory until years from now when I have to go work through it in trauma counseling. Today's video is going to be a little different. It's a sewing video. I've been sewing for about 2 years, and I honestly love it so much. What you're looking at is the top of a quilt that I started making in January of this year. It's my very first quilt, and I'm making it for a friend of mine. This footage you're watching today is from May. I had finished the quilt top by the end of February, but due to being very broke and completely thrown off my routine from the pandemic starting, paused on continuing for several months. Here I'm setting out the batting to put together what's called the quilt sandwich. The quilt sandwich is made up of 3 layers: the quilt top, the batting, and the backing fabric. At first, I laid the quilt top right side down and added the batting on top of it, but then I realized that was stupid because I couldn't see where the quilt top was, so I moved the batting to the bottom and put the quilt top on top. The most difficult part about this was how tight the space was. As you can see, I had to move some furniture out of the way, and I was still literally ass up against my desk, my couch, the wall, and the other wall where Lauren's camera was standing. I feel most comfortable if I have as much room as possible to work in, but unfortunately that wasn't feasible given how fucking stupidly huge I made this quilt. Next I had to do a lot of smoothing out, excuse the booty footage there, before I could start trimming the edges. I bought this batting in March for $22 on Amazon. It's Pellon brand cotton batting at a king size. If you've ever shopped for batting before, you'll know how insanely good this price is. I'll leave a link to this batting in the description below. It doesn't fall apart very easily and it's very soft. I kept all the trim and I still have it in a box stored away for future projects. One thing to note is that I didn't pre-wash my batting. I know pre-washing is kind of a big subject of debate in quilting, and while I did pre-wash all the cotton fabric for the backing and the quilt top, I honestly just said fuck it for the batting because I figured it'll make a dope scrunchy look after the final wash. If I'm wrong, well, fuck, it's my first quilt and it's a learning experience, okay? Here you can see me pinning the batting and the quilt top together. This is just to keep it attached so any shifting I did wouldn't fuck things up too badly. Fun fact, while I was putting this sandwich together, I had on a playlist of Steven Universe songs. During this part specifically, I was looping Something Entirely New, which is one of my favorites. So now I've moved on to the backing, which is this lovely brown fabric. I did attempt to iron it, but it was so big and it was going to take so long that I decided it wasn't worth the time. There's so many aspects to quilting that make this such a long process, and having ADHD, I find finishing anything to be a massive undertaking, so cutting corners is sometimes necessary to actually get something done. At this point, I started measuring some shit. I honestly couldn't tell you what exactly I was measuring. I didn't do a whole lot of measuring properly while I was putting the quilt together. I have a tendency to kind of do a little bit of measuring and then be like, I'll just figure it out later. That's a problem for future me. So future me, which was right here, was trying to figure out how to consolidate kind of all the errors that I had made, including the fact that if you notice, the top and bottom part of the quilt don't have a gray border and are very uneven. I was gonna add a gray border to them, but then I was like, I just don't want to. I'm tired. I want this to be done. I was also a little bit stumped because the quilt batting was bigger than my backing. In a quilt sandwich, the backing is supposed to be bigger than the batting, which is supposed to be bigger than the top. But because the space was so cramped and I'm absolutely atrocious at measurements, I just kind of had to eyeball it and hope for the best. You can see I'm putting down some basting adhesive to help keep the layers together. Basting adhesive doesn't stick forever, it just sticks for a little bit while you're putting things together to make sure stuff doesn't shift. So then on top of that, I had to add some safety pins to make sure that before I put in the stabilizing stitches, things wouldn't get too shifted or too fucked up. There was a lot in this process that was just kind of smoothing out stuff over and over again, making sure things were in a decent amount of space, making sure I had enough batting and backing on the outside edges to accommodate any shifting. One of the reasons I taught myself how to sew was because I had always been fascinated with sewing, just in general growing up, but I never felt like I could really attempt it because it just seemed like such a domestic, feminine task that I just was kind of embarrassed to even try. It also didn't help that my mom has this tendency to pretend she's like allergic to sewing because she was, I guess, traumatized by trying to learn how to sew in home economics back in the like 60s. So it wasn't super encouraged for me to learn how to sew. I did learn to sew a little bit from my dad, actually, just by hand, like how to put a button on stuff or do super basic mending. My dad's a super macho guy, so I kind of should have put two and two together that it was probably okay. But anyway, I got my sewing machine in 2012, and it kind of just sat around for several years before I finally felt comfortable enough to actually teach myself how to do anything. Since learning to sew, I've made plushies, I've made napkins, I've made blankets, I've made a couple of clothing items, mainly just some PJ pants. I would really like to get into making apparel at some point. I find making clothes to be a really fascinating thing that I would like to tackle one day, but it's just super intimidating and I can't really draw clothes very well. So that's something else I would kind of have to practice before I felt like I could really undertake this. Ripley. Ripley. Now I'm taking the quilt to the machine to add in some stabilizing stitches all around. Doing this means I'll get to take out the safety pins and I won't have to worry about a bunch of shifting. I use a move called Stitch in the Ditch for these, which is where you sew right along the seam lines so that you won't see the stitches, at least on the top. A couple of things I discovered during this process is that, number one, quilting requires some muscles, man. I don't know how these little tiny old grannies do it because I was like, I'm tired just pushing around all this fabric. Honestly, it's hard on your hands, it's hard on your arms and shoulders. It's just a lot of fabric to keep pushing and shifting around, and you have to start and stop so often. Not to mention, you can see the throat on my sewing machine is really small, so I have to shove a ton of fabric through that area in order to get some stuff done. I usually try to keep most of it to my left, but sometimes that's not always possible. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I have some plans for how I'm going to be bringing out videos next year. I'm gonna have to scale back. I'm gonna aim to do about 2 videos a month to YouTube, as well as streaming twice a month. I'm going to try to make sure that, at least on a consistent basis somewhat, I'm getting video content out for all of you. And also because it's just something I greatly enjoy, and it really makes me sad when I can't make stuff. With that, I would like to just say thank you so much for watching, and thank you so much to my patrons, especially John Filer and Reamston, for giving me their support. If you'd like to become a patron, the link is down in the description below. I hope you all have had a wonderful holiday season, and I hope that you have a great new year, hopefully not with a big party involved, you know, social distancing and all that shit. And of course, let's hope for a fun 2021. Surely it must be better than this year was. I hope. Love you all. Happy New Year. Goodbye.